Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today, we're talking about the 50 Shades of Grey on the Battleship. People think of battleships as being gray. In fact, the Measure 22 camouflage scheme that just has ships painted haze gray is known as Battleship Gray. But there are actually 10 different shades of gray used on board the ship. So we are in one of a series of paint lockers on board the ship, and in today's video we're going to explore them all. But basically we are down on 5th deck, all the way up forward, just aft of frame 12. So we're between frame 12 and frame 20 on 5th deck, and basically this whole series of spaces going back up towards 2nd deck is dedicated to paint stowage, paint safety, and paint mixing. So we'll show you some shelves with stowage here in a minute. Just talking about safety, here's one feature that you're going to see throughout all of the paint mixing spaces, and that is the remnants of a CO2 suppression system. So if there was a fire in this space, remember paint is a flammable liquid, so we're holding literally hundreds of gallons of it here in the unarmored forward part of the ship. If that starts to burn, we evacuate the space immediately and the fire suppression system goes off. So there are actually sensors built into this, and that can detect the air quality. If there's too much paint fumes coming on, there are vents to exhaust those fumes. But if something goes wrong and there's a fire and it starts detecting carbon monoxide or buildup of fumes or anything like that, then it'll set off an alarm and you can set off the CO2 system, and that sets off another alarm that gives the sailors down here just enough chance to make it to a door. So it will smother the fire, and the tanks would be here. They go into a system that runs all the way through these spaces, and then they come out of little exhausts like this one, low to the ground. And then your fire has no air to burn anymore. Same for your sailors. This system is purely a 1980s system. I don't believe there was any similar system in World War II. I believe there were just ventilators up forward here to ventilate fume and smoke and that sort of stuff. Now, just while we're here, another neat feature that you see that's completely unrelated to everything else is this box up here. Those are actually the MF and Q coils for our degaussing system. So we're roughly where the waterline would have been when the ship was in service, although we're above the waterline now, which is why it's so freaking hot in here. But the MF and Q coils are putting an electric charge into the hull of the ship. So that basically run all the way around the hull, and that will cancel out the ship's magnetic field to help protect us from magnetic detonators on mines and torpedoes. It was a World War II innovation that saw itself installed on all these World War II ships. And you'll see us talk about it more in some of our videos back in the engineering spaces, so I won't cover it anymore today. Another safety feature in here is the globe-type lighting fixtures. In the 1980s, they switched from globe-type fixtures like that throughout most of the ship to fluorescent tube fixtures. But because those fixtures could break and you might get an arc of electricity which might set off fumes, all the ones in spaces like this, or magazines, have globe-type fixtures, which are much harder to break. They're just using incandescent bulbs, though. So we talked about how there are 50 shades of gray on the Battleship. And really there's a whole spectrum of color, from the white that they use for the most of the interior spaces of the ship, all the way up to the black that they use for the boot topping, that stripe between the waterline and the top of the hull. First of all, there's a manual with all of these colors and what sort of spaces are supposed to be painted in what color, and that manual is updated probably every decade or so. But some of the shades in this spectrum include that white I talked about before. It's not just any white, it's whiter than white. Extra white is what it's called. The most boring of all colors. Slightly above that, you've got equipment gray, which has kind of a light gray hue to it. And then above that is light gray, which has sort of a greenish tint to it. And these tend to be the colors that you see lockers and bunks and mechanical equipment painted in throughout the ship. Eventually you get up to medium gray, which is that color that the entire hull of the ship is painted in. Above medium gray, you've got deck gray, which is a little bit darker, and blue gray, which is darker still. And then you finally start to get to your black, which you would think would have a fancier title. Up here on the shelf, it's just labeled as boot topping, because that's where they used it. Another shelf is labeled black, anchor, which I guess is a different shade than boot topping. I can tell the difference between all the shades of gray. When you get to shades of black, I can't see any difference. It might be a gloss versus non-gloss or semi-gloss. I don't know. Now we're up on 4th deck, one level above where we were, at frame 19. This is the trunk that accesses all of these various paint storage areas. So it goes all the way up to main deck and all the way down to 7th deck. The trunk is where you control the CO2 suppression system. So if your alarms go off and you get a warning, you've got a comically, definitely not battleship-sized hammer to break the glass and pull the lever to activate the fire suppression system. This space has more shelves for paint, pretty identical to what's down below. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head quite how much weight of paint the battleship has. I calculated that it takes roughly 200 tons of paint to paint the hull of the ship. That's several coats, the full system of coatings, not just to paint the whole area, but probably about 50 tons just to get a thin coating on the whole hull of the ship. So this ship carries a lot of paint. You're going to see all of the various spaces that we go through that are dedicated just to paint. During the treaty era, when these ships were being designed, weight was very important. You had to get them under the treaty restrictions. With the 10,000-ton tin-clad cruisers of the Pensacola, Northampton, Portland, and New Orleans classes, they were so worried about paint that they switched over from lead-based paint to a lighter version of paint. And they found that by switching away from lead-based paint on these ships, they were able to save 10 tons in the painting of these vessels. These vessels are roughly 1/5 the displacement of the battleship. So Battleship New Jersey, being a war-built ship and no longer being worried about the treaty restrictions, did originally have lead-based paint. But by the 1980s, when she was being repainted for service periodically, they had switched to other sorts of epoxies and other based paints. Now we're up on 3rd deck between frames 14 and 19, so pretty far forward, and we're roughly where the normal waterline would be for this ship. You can see that the bulkhead is flaring out up above, and it comes into its minimum width, and then as you get to the lower part, it starts to flare back out, and all the spaces below us, we saw the walls flaring out towards that bulbous bow that the Iowas have. So this space, originally you stick your head in and you look at all these line stowage racks and you think, okay, this isn't for paint stowage. And yet it's got the CO2 suppression system. And it does have a few small areas of shelving like these behind me for paint storage. So clearly this was part of that arrangement. So we started to look further, and it's got a pair of locked lockers in addition to this space, which would normally be dogged under most conditions. And that is for alcohol stowage and for acid stowage. And both of these components would be used in paint removal, I suspect. So any of your denatured alcohol that you might use for cleaning, or turpentines or any of those sorts of things, or the acids that you might use to strip the galvanized coating off of steel, are stored separately in here. And they're hazardous materials, and they're, of course, very flammable. So they're all in this area. What interests me is looking at the bulkheads here, there's very little insulation. And there's no insulation at all in the overhead. We're actually forward of the teak wood deck. So it is quite hot in here. There's no air conditioning. There is ventilation to draw fumes out, but there isn't like there is a little bit of supply coming in when those vents are on, but it's not a particularly climate-controlled space. Like the magazines, even during World War II, had a chilled water radiator system refrigerating them. And even though you're storing flammable, or in some places it's stenciled as inflammable, I don't know the difference between those two words. Why does flammable and inflammable mean the same things? But even though they're storing stuff like that in here, they didn't bother to insulate or control the temperature in any way, which I think would cause an issue, especially with alcohol evaporating and then those flammable fumes being able to get out into the space. But I am aware of no issues with fires in the paint lockers on Iowa-class battleships. Now we're in the flammable liquids locker. So what are some other flammable liquids we haven't discussed yet? We've already seen alcohol, acids, and paint. This would probably be primarily stains. So the ship did carry a couple of different colored wood stains. There's some speculation as to whether they ever stained the teak deck, but when they were making plaques or doing other things like that, they used stains for it, and so they carried an amount of it. Interestingly, this space and the next space we go to are not actually attached to the various paint spaces. There is a bulkhead right here, which, as you can see, now has a door, but would not have when the ship was in service. So this room would have been like a locked little annex. The Navy, when the ship was put into mothballs, cut a hole for inspectors to go through and a hole for the ventilating ductwork to go through as part of the dehumidification equipment. And this allows them to caulk shut all of the hatches in the main deck, which are the only way to get down here normally, and still have their inspectors go in and check out all of these spaces while the ship is in mothballs. And finally, the furthest forward of all the spaces we've been in here on second deck, from frames 6 to 10, is the paint mixing station. It's really interesting to me that this is not anywhere near the trunk that leads down to the paint lockers. For whatever reason, this space is another compartment or two forward, so you'd have to take the paint up onto the main deck, bring it forward about 10-20 feet, and then drop it down another trunk to get in here, mix it, and send it back up. What's a paint mixing station for? A lot of our paints come in two parts, especially epoxy type paints. You get a part A and a part B, and when you mix them together, they start to set immediately, so you've got to paint it right then and there. But when you've got it stored in its two parts, it'll last for a while. Other things, the Navy sends out certain formulas for paint. So I've already told you about some of the many shades of gray. We also had a ton of other colors on board. The deck in here is painted what I call tile red, what they call terracotta red. There is oranges and purples and reds and greens and all sorts of other colors, usually used to delineate what type of liquid is flowing through particular plumbing. So for example, the red in here is for the fire suppression system, CO2 in this case, but also our firefighting liquid lines are also painted red. And there's different colors for different things. So there's a lot of blue trim in officers' country. There's browns, there's primers, which can be basically any color because they're going to be covered by paint. So you think of a color and this ship carries a wide array of it. On the outside, you may only see Battleship gray, but on the inside, there is a broad array of colors, but mostly extra white. So who paints on board the ship? Well, large areas of the ship, like the exterior, is often painted in a shipyard where they can blast it and then spray coats on quickly. And how often do you have to do that? Typically, the ship would go into dry dock about every 2, 3, 4 years, something like that. And you may not paint the entire hull each of those times, but pretty frequently. A coat of Navy paint might be good for 5 years. As a museum where we're not using the ship as much, and I actually think some of the systems of coatings we're using today in the modern day as a museum are better than the Navy coatings. That gives us 10 years in some cases when it's applied right. And I dare say Battleship New Jersey looks like she's in better shape here than a ship returning from an active deployment does. That said, we're not using the ship, so it's not deteriorating as quickly as an active ship. There are certainly still places with rust. Primarily, it would be your deck divisions that would do a lot of the everyday painting on the ship. But you've got somewhere between 1,600 and 2,800 17-year-old boys running around this thing with too much time on their hand. So at different times, everybody would be painting. Different compartments have different divisions in charge of them. And oftentimes those divisions will place 1 or 2 sailors in charge of an individual space. So that sailor is in charge of making sure that ship is clean and can pass inspection. And so he would be required to do a lot of the painting work in that individual space. For things like painting the hull of the ship so it looks good, that would be done by large parts of the crew. And certainly I've heard stories during World War II when these ships were just painting over their entire camouflage scheme, that you would have basically, the captain would say, nobody gets liberty until the job is done. So absolutely every hand would turn out from the captain down to the newest seaman apprentice, and they would hang out on Jacob's ladders and paint the entire ship. Iowa-class battleships had a couple of different paint schemes, and they're pretty distinctive. Battleship New Jersey was the only Iowa to get Measure 22, which was all over navy blue with deck blue on top, which was a slightly different shade, but basically it's all navy blue. And at a distance, it looked black, so that's how the ship got the nickname the Black Dragon. And she had this paint scheme from when she was commissioned basically until she went into the yard in mid-1945. At that point, she was painted, it's the scheme where everything from the lowest part of the main deck down is painted dark blue, the straight line, and everything above it is painted in a lighter gray color. So that Measure 22 is designed for aerial observation, particularly in the Western Pacific. So the ship is supposed to blend in with the water, whether the aircraft's looking at it from side on or above. The other paint scheme is also designed for aerial detection. They found that a dark colored ship sitting over the horizon can be spotted at a distance. So by painting everything from the line up a lighter color like the sky and everything from the line down a darker color, it was better for throwing off kamikazes, which would often come in below the radar, so they're looking for stuff popping up over the horizon. And you see the bulk of the Pacific Fleet repainted in this color in 1945. Post-war, the ship returns to her peacetime gray color, which is also the color I believe she was painted in while under construction. And basically, she maintains that paint scheme for the rest of her career. So there is, the sides of the ship are a medium gray color. They're pretty light gray, which you can still see on modern ships. The hull numbers are really big, so you can identify which ship it is. And the decks are unpainted. So on a wood deck ship like this, you get a really blonde color. Pieces of steel that are horizontal get a deck blue color, a navy blue looking color, that really dark gray. So the turret tops, the 5-inch gun tops, the steel decks above are that color. And that would have been how she looked through Korea, Vietnam, and the 1980s. The thing is, camouflage has sort of gone out of style with large ships like this one since the invention of radar. You're not worried about blocking visual detection because they can see you on their scopes. Typically, as a museum ship, we try to repaint the ship the exact same color it was. One major exception to this is the areas of the main deck that are normally painted that deck gray color. We have toned that down several shades of gray. The really dark gray approaching black absorbs sunlight. And our climate control system isn't the same brute force system that the Navy had on board. And we try to keep the ship a little bit lower temperatures than the Navy did for visitor comfort. So we painted it a lighter color on purpose to absorb less of that heat from the sun. Different museum ships that are primarily from World War II were often given to their organizations in the peacetime light gray camouflage scheme, or lack of camouflage, I should say. And many ships like Slater and North Carolina have backdated their ships, Battleship Texas as well, and painted them in their wartime camouflage schemes, which is extremely visually compelling. Why doesn't Battleship New Jersey do this? Well, our period of interpretation is the late 80s, during the end of the ship's career. And because nothing else on the ship looks like it did during World War II, it would make no sense to paint World War II style camouflage scheme on her. And our World War II camouflage schemes are pretty bland. You just paint the ship nearly black and make it 100 degrees inside, or you paint the ship half black and half gray. That's not nearly as visually compelling as the schemes on, say, Slater, North Carolina. If you're interested in this conversation on camouflage, we're going to shoot a separate video on the different types of camouflage the US Navy used during World War II. Let us know in the comment section down below if you would like to see that in the near future. And if you would like to help us paint the ship, it's an ongoing process. We would love to have more volunteers come out to help. There's a link in the description below for information. If you can't come out in person and support us, there's a link in the description below that will allow you to make donations to the museum. And you can say, I want to make that donation to the YouTube channel, or to the general maintenance of the ship, or to painting the ship, and let us know what it is you want to support. We really appreciate it. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of institutions and private individuals like yourselves. Another way you can support us is by liking, sharing, and subscribing, so more people are exposed to our videos and the paint fumes from them. That will also help you out, because then you'll start getting notified every time we put up a new video. Thanks for watching.